Silvia Federici is a teacher and a scholar and an activist who now lives and works in the US, and she is from the tradition of autonomous Marxist feminist scholarship, and she has agreed to do an interview with us here today. So thank you very much for doing this interview with GenderLink, Silvia, and it's lovely to have you.
Thanks to you for inviting me.
So you have been in South Africa to launch your book Revolution at Point Zero, and if you could just tell us maybe some of the main ideas that are in that book and how that has been received in South Africa so far.
Thank you. The book has been received very well. I'm very happy to see that people have been very engaged in the discussion, workshops that we had with the main themes of the book. The book has a collection of essays that covers a period of almost 30-40 years. From early essays I wrote in the context of the feminist movements in the United States to essays that I wrote in recent years about the destruction of the global economy, and in particular the question of reproduction, how social reproduction has been affected by the processes of globalization. And in fact, social reproduction is really the main theme of the book in all its different connotations. I centered on this question in my political work as well as in my writing, because there's a very profound connection between the situation of women across the world and their social position, and the fact that in our society, in every country, social reproduction, and particularly those aspects of social reproduction that are connected with what traditionally has been called women's labor, domestic work, housework, have been generally devalued. So I've been very interested, together with other women, understanding the roots of this devaluation. Why in this society the work, the activities that are most important for the reproduction of life, and are also most important for the reproduction of the workforce, are in fact very often not seen as work. They are not remunerated, and in fact, if a woman is engaged in this activity in a full-time way, she ends up being dependent on a man, and she often ends up being seen as someone who is not working. So many of the articles in the book are very much concerned with understanding, how social reproduction has been constructed, particularly in capitalist society, how its devaluation has affected women's life and women's work, and what kind of struggles we must engage in to change that, because it is unacceptable that, again, the work and activity that sustain life and in fact produces the workforce, makes it possible for other people to work, continues to be devalued.
Well, one of those struggles and those movements was wages for housework, and you were a key figure in starting that movement. How did that come about, and what were you guys saying?
Yes, I was one of the key figures, not one. Yeah, the Wages for Housework campaign, it was an international campaign that began in the early 70s, launched by a number of women coming from different countries. At the beginning it was Italy, England, the United States, and later it expanded to Germany, Switzerland, France. In different countries we had groups. Also there were different branches of Wages for Housework in the United States. It originated precisely from the analysis that I was beginning to sketch out, an analysis that basically connected the devaluation of women's position in society with the devaluation of social reproduction. And in a sense, saw the campaign as a way, a vehicle, both to revalorize housework, both to gain some remuneration for this work and counter the whole trend which has been to make it invisible as work. And at the same time also, to basically challenge a whole capitalist organizational work, a whole division of labor that has really concentrated on wage work, production for the market as the only type of work and activity that produces social wealth. And so for us, the campaign had both an economic dimension to give people who are involved in this work, not just women. In fact, the struggle was wages for housework, not wages for women, not wages for housewife. In fact, we thought that the fact that this work was not remunerated was very much responsible for naturalizing it, for making it appear as something that pertained to women's psychology, femininity, that the moment in which this work would be waged, it would be desexualized. You'll begin to see for what it is, which is a social activity, and not something pertaining to women's body or women's mind, assuming there is such a thing. So for us, again, it had both an economic dimension in terms of being able to attach some remuneration for people who perform this work and not condemn them to dependence. And also we saw it as a vehicle to change power relation between women and men and to basically challenge the structure of society that does not recognize the value of a work that is incredibly important. And this, I think, I want to underline this point. We saw it also as a first step in transforming the work itself. In fact, or reorganizing this work in a very different way that is less isolating for those who perform it. And it's that it could open it up to new forms of cooperation in the performance of this work.
Okay, I think that's really interesting. I think in South Africa there are so many spaces in which that cooperation is already happening and that there is collective work being done, but it still remains women's work in many ways. And one of the things that is often said in South African society is that, it's about culture, and that culture is often used as a disciplining tool and a disciplining mechanism to keep women in that space.
Yes.
And so, I just wanted to know what you think about that, because there's already these collective forms of work happening.
Yes.
But it seems as if the valorization is not there, or the justification is through culture. And so how would we move past that specific?
Well, like concept like culture and tradition are very treacherous, and we have to be very, very careful, because first of all, culture is no justification for anything, for any form of social behavior. The question is always whether culture is based on justice or it is based on prejudice. And, we need to change culture. And moreover, many times what is referred to as culture is something non-existent. It's a construction. It's something that is very constructed. For example, when people speak of African culture, it's a fiction. If you look actually at the continent as a whole, from Egypt, to South Africa, you will see there is a great variety of cultures. And there are very different cultures also within each country, depending on the class to which people belong, right? So I think that argument has to be put to rest. And we have to move away from this notion of culture and tradition. We have to ask, whether behavior and values correspond to criteria and contribute, to the promotion of social justice or not. This should be the fundamental measure to decide if any particular form of behavior should be dismissed or should be continued.
One of the things you speak about specifically is this idea of solidarity, and I just wanted to ask, what do those issues like rape or the subjugation of women, or even the exploitation of women in the home in that way, or using culture as a disciplining tool, what does it take away from the idea of a human solidarity against capitalist domination and exploitation?
Yeah, that's a very important question, because I think that many men feel threatened, when women are fighting, as they have been, to have more economic independence, to have a life that is more autonomous, and to be treated on a basis of equal standing, as in front of the law, in front of the political world, and economically. Then men, of course, are threatened, and of course they use concepts such as culture, and in many ways we have also seen a surge of violence against women. And I think it is very important to see that this violence, it's a violence, of course, that is unacceptable. Any form of violence against the human beings and abuse is unacceptable, but it's also something that breaks down the solidarity between women and men, and weakens, the kind of struggle that people need to make today in order to transform society, in order to create a society that is more just. You cannot have a struggle that is successful when you have many of its members, many of the people are participating in, turn against the other and brutalize them. That's a divisive type of behavior. It sabotages the struggle itself. It's so important to make men understand that in abusing women, in oppressing them, in seeing them as sexual object and attacking them as sexual object, they are actually, hurting themselves. They are actually turning against themselves. That in further devaluing the people who have reproduced their life and reproducing their life, they devalue their own lives. And I think that is important, that women of the younger generation really make that connection very strongly.
I think for me, what happens in a state, or in a society that is governed by a state, is this idea of, well, women will reach equality or emancipation through rights, and that's when they will become equal, and that's when people will start to recognize them. But I feel like human rights is not going to get us to the point that we need to be at. But how do we say, well,
more is necessary.
Yes, more is necessary.
Yes.
And how do we begin to start having that conversation
right.
of, I don't just want legal rights. It doesn't help me.
It's very, very important. In fact, the kind of feminism that I have committed myself to, from the early 70s and continuously through my own life, and of course I'm not unique because I've always worked with other women. It's been a feminism that has really not been part of the mainstream, where the mainstream has really made the struggle for equality and for rights. And we have had problem with both. Not, of course, that we're not against equality, but we have to really understand what is equality. What does it mean to fight for equality between women and men? And first of all, it assumes that men are already in a desirable position. It does not acknowledge that men are exploited in this society. And so in a way, we don't want to fight for shifting from one type of exploitation to another. And also that struggle for equality does not really go to the core of what is keeping in this society women and men, in a sense, in prison, exploited, although in different ways, and though with different degrees, intensity of exploitation. So for us, the most important thing was, in fact, to begin to look at the mechanisms. What are the social structures, right? Why is this society, which has extracted immense amount of labor from people, which, this modern capitalism that is basically extracting wealth from people's labor, and as well from all over the land, the forest, the environment. They're consuming the earth, and yet they continuously tell us that that we cannot have really a decent life. Why? And then beginning to see how important it has been, for the accumulation of wealth by the capitalist class, to keep the production of the workforce, to devalue it, to keep the process of social reproduction, in a condition in which it did not have to be compensated, so that enormous amount of money was saved to actually bring to the surface, to the foreground, those structures as being extremely important. And once you do that, then you cannot only struggle for equality. Then you have to see that something much more structural has to change. That is the organization of work. It's the goal of what society is about that has to be really challenged. And this applies also to the struggle for rights. Because when we ask women's rights, gay rights, etc., we're basically, in a way, fighting in a way that encloses us in these real small cocoons, and where we do not see the connection between all our situations, and where it becomes difficult to, build a struggle that is leading to the cooperation of all the different sectors of the population who are exploited. Also, when you struggle in the name of rights, you say, I have a right as a woman. You still do not name what are the obstacles in society that you're facing that are, in fact, standing in the way, to achieve, those rights. So the struggle about rights never names, for example, the particular structure and forms of exploitation that exist in capitalist society. Why, for example, women are very often in a degraded position. It says, well, this is what we want, but it doesn't say what stands in the way. And so those struggles are not amenable to really a structural change, to really transformative type of politics that changes the society. Because I'm absolutely convinced that we cannot achieve so-called women's liberation or anybody's liberation unless the society is changed, unless the society is transformed.
I agree with a lot of what you've said, and I think what stands out for me again from Southern African politics and even in South Africa is this specific idea of feminism and feminist struggle, where often women in South Africa are organizing together with men around things like unemployment or access to land, or access to resources. And often women's organization is around the family, things like security for their children, or food, or against police brutality. And the women in Marikana, that's one of their main struggles as well. But you have feminists saying, well, not all women's struggles are feminist struggles. That there's this difference, that women's organization or women's activities must be feminist in nature. And I think that also speaks to what you were saying, because when women organize around the family. I mean, how should we see that?
In every struggle, there's a feminist perspective. Every struggle has a feminist perspective. In other words, it's not, say, every struggle, it's a women's struggle. There's a particular perspective that you bring to it, And the perspective, for example, is that if you struggle, whether it is for housing or if you struggle for land, you have to struggle in a way that recognizes that in society, the issue of housing, the issue of land, the issue of healthcare does not affect everybody in the same way. So we have different social subjects with different needs. And when we make a struggle, we have to make sure that in the way we conduct the struggle and in the goals that we pose, those differences are recognized. Let's say that you make a struggle and there's women and men, mothers and non-mothers. Well, immediately the issue comes about organizing having a meeting, because some women may have children to take care at home. Are you going to have a daycare at the meeting or not? Are you going to organize in a way that makes it possible, for women who have obligation at home to participate, not to be excluded because of those obligations? And when you think about what you're demanding, let's use the struggle around housing. You have to understand that there are different needs. So are you going to have in mind only a kind of abstract human being, or you're going to have in mind in a struggle for housing, a set of demands, a set of issues that take into account the different situation between women and men. So I think that women have to be involved in all of these struggles. But it's also important that we bring to this struggle the knowledge. First of all, the knowledge that we have from our situation, from our history, but also the knowledge that comes from the fact that we have different needs. And the moment in which those needs are pushed under the carpet, then everybody suffers, So also in relation to women struggling around the family, right? In fact, this is an issue that has been raised many, many times, I've been very inspired, by the struggle that women have made in the Americas, particularly South America, where, in response to structural adjustment and very, very serious, stiff austerity programs, which have pauperized, immiserated a lot of people. Women have come forward and they have begun to organize reproduction in a more cooperative way, because they've decided that if they were cooking together, it was possible to feed more people. So they started to organize a popular kitchen. They organized shopping committees. Shopping together stretches your budget. You can actually buy something more. And they organized this activity as wives and mothers for the protection of their families. But actually, when they started coming together, they didn't organize as feminists, right? But when they started coming together, working together, cooking, all kinds of things began to happen that transformed their life, transformed their relationship with each other, transformed the organization of reproduction in a way that we would perhaps recognize as feminist, because they began to speak of their experience as women. They began also to recognize that their relationship with men, the problems that each of them individually had, were not individual problems, that there was really common issues that they had to begin to address, like the issue of battering, the fact that men, often abused them physically and also emotionally. So that you can see how the moment in which women took the initiative of taking their life in their hands, of coming together, tackling the problems the issues that they all had. Also, this moment, this had a transformative impact, and an impact that, in fact, raised our consciousness, not only as mother and wives, but as women, and increased their knowledge and also their sense of self-confidence and self-value.
For sure, and I think that just takes us right back to what you said, that wages for housework was the first step.
Yes, it's first step. It's
not
an end point.
Yes, and
exactly.
And then there's all these alternative spaces,
yes.
opening up around those ideas, and the question of the commons and what that means, to collectivize labor. You spoke about the commons also in your book. You have a paper on it there, and the idea of how it has shifted over time, and what it means now, and how we protect that. Protect that idea from capitalism co-opting it again, and you see that happening more and more in Southern Africa as well, and the idea of eco-tourism or eco-estates, just the enclosure of land and the enclosure of public spaces. And do you think that is particularly happening at a large scale on the African continent right now?
Well, this is the broad question. I'm glad you're bringing up the concept of the commons, which really goes hand in hand with notion of wages for housework, social reproduction. We have begun also to speak of this idea of the commons precisely to bring out, this need for more cooperative form of organization. So that, for example, just remaining on the ground of domestic work is, we certainly want to valorize it. We want to make sure that, the position, the way society looks at it is changed, but also it has to be organized in a different ways, more cooperative and so forth. And this idea of the commons also has extended to many other areas of social life that we would like to see transformed, and has been very much brought to the foreground by the fact that with the neoliberalism, practically we have witnessed a very, a wave of privatizations. Everything now is being privatized. Everything now is made a market of. Everything is becoming a commodity as a price tag. Now we have to buy water, soon we'll have to buy air. We cannot stay on the pavement, you have to pay if you even sit on the side of the road. They are now trying to push people away from the streets, doing vending and so forth. So this idea of, and above all, neoliberalism has promoted this very aggressive individualist ideology, that there is not really a common good. We are all like self-investors. We all have to think of our self-interest. And if you want education, well, you have to invest in your future. You have to invest, which is a very divisive, very competitive conception of human beings, of society. And we are really rejecting that. This is a very destructive conception of society. We already see that. So the idea of the common is really a countering against that, trend that pushes us to always see each other as competitors. And also, in a sense, is continuously excluding us, from the Commonwealth, so that we don't have any longer access to anything, whether it is the waters, the seas, the forests. Everything is being privatized, taken over by companies. And I don't think there is a place now in the world where this process is as extensive, as virulent as in Africa. I think that in Africa, the land expropriation in Africa, enclosures, the fact that people are being pushed out, have been going on, of course, for a long time through colonialism, with colonialism. But now, in a way, it's a turning point. because now you have the thrust to enclosure, to privatization, land grabbing is coming from so many different sources. Because you have the mining company, and I know in South Africa you know very, very well, you know, then you have also agribusiness. You have all these companies, the Monsanto and so forth there. You have agrofuel with this idea of green capitalism, the green world. Actually, the green world, it's, you know, the excuse, you know, for taking over huge, immense tracts of land, you know, that are then devoted to building elephant grass, you know, to feed our cars and so forth. So there is really a convergence that it's leading in the direction of people losing the land, even in areas where still land remained and where land was still held in common, even after the inception of colonialism. In many parts of West Africa, for example, until the 1980s, you know, many people, you still had the communal, you still had customary law. You still had communal ownership of land. Of course, it had gone through many changes, but now that is under attack, you know, and this is a very, very serious situation. A serious situation because we already see that when the land is taken away, and land understood in a broad sense, land in forest, means coastal waters that now are used for aquaculture, you know. It means basically the seas, you know, land, it has to be used in a very broad sense. When that is privatized, then people are being expelled, and we're already seeing a major, major migratory wave. You know, now you have every year hundreds of thousands of young men and women who from Africa, you know, are crossing the Sahara and they are going to migrating any part of Europe, America, where they're trying to eke out a living. And I have to say that it's terrible what is happening on that ground, because now Europe, you know, it's properly called Fortress Europe, because they're making all this legislation to limit immigration. At the same time that the European or American company are coming here and taking away the land and creating the condition that makes people have to migrate. And the Mediterranean is a grave. I assure you there are about 10,000, they calculated there are about 10,000 bodies in the Mediterranean because people take boats and the boats often capsize and the boats try to escape the Coast Guard. The Mediterranean is a grave of young Africans, you know, that have tried to leave their country for a better future and sometimes never make it, but they remain in the bottom of the sea. So it's a very serious situation that I think the new generation of African men and women have to fight against, as well as we have to fight in Europe against it.
Governments here are allowing that. They are making it happen. In South Africa, you know, Jacob Zuma, who's the president, is building this 200 million rand house on tribal land, you know, and he says, at first he said he didn't know anything about the house, and then he said he took a bond out. We know you can't take a bond out on tribal land. You know, that land is supposed to be held in common, and yet there's the president of the country engaging in these activities and so openly and so blatantly. And I think that something also needs to happen here in the political culture and in the way in which people challenge that, because it needs to be challenged, not only capitalism through big companies, but also the idea of corruption and the growing authoritarianism around that here, which makes it a comfortable space for that kind of enclosure to happen.
And we need to challenge organizations like the World Bank, who have basically been spearheading the land privatization and the creation of land market, and they have been spearheading programs of land reform that have nothing to do with the kind of land reform that people fought for in the anti-colonial struggle. the kind of land reform that Fanon speaks about, people actually reclaiming the land. But there have been, the land reform has been precisely giving these individual titles and putting a price tag on the land. That's the kind of land reform.
And very
patriarchal
as well.
Very, very
Women
patriarchal.
Are completely missing
Yes.
from land reform
Absolutely.
policies.
And at the same time, the World Bank is also attacking all forms of subsistence farming. They want to see every form of food production, agricultural production, as for the market. Everything for the market. And when you read their report, they are all represented. Women who are farming for their families, for their community, as this backward character, who are breaking their back, with the hoe, trying to grow food with the hoe, and it's an image of, as if they were the cause of poverty, And then they're promoting this ideology, which is very, very destructive, that it's not really land that is productive, it's money that is productive. So the use of the land, the best way in which you can use the land is to take the land and bring it to the bank and use it as a collateral for a loan. And then with that loan, presumably you can set up a business and so on, which is really the quickest way to lose your land.
Yes.
It's really the quickest way to lose your land. And the other thing that World Bank has been promoting, which is very, we have to be very, very careful and demystify, because they continuously speak about global commons. They are the representative of humanity, and they are saving the global common. Like they tell us they are saving the Amazons. So how are they saving the Amazon? How they are protecting the global commons? Basically they are protecting them by pushing away, chasing away the people who had been living in this area. Many indigenous communities who have been living in this area for thousands of years. And then they open up these areas for ecotourism, game park, which means that those who have access to them are people who can pay. Whereas the people who have been living there, they're seen as destroyers, of this heritage of humanity. So we have to speak of commons, we have to speak of cooperation, we have to speak about the earth is our commonwealth, but we also have to be careful of these usages, which are very treacherous and mystifying, because there's no such a thing as a global commons. We can speak of commons in the area in which we live, and in the area in which we support ourselves, and commons imply not only rights, but imply also obligation. So, for example, I have no right to expect or say how land should be used in Brazil, or how land should be used in South Africa when I live in New York. These are the commons of the people who are in South Africa, who are in Brazil. And when the World Bank elects itself to be the representative of humanity, in reality what they represent is the companies, is international capital, who now is claiming that they are the best managers of the world.
Thank you very, very much for talking to us and for being here. And is there anything else you'd like to add?
I would like to add that this has been a very, very educational journey for me to come here, and I'm very, very grateful to the people who have brought me here, because it's been a fantastic experience.